My parents refused to attend my wedding because my brother scheduled his engagement party on the same day. But then they called me selfish when they discovered another family proudly took her place. I grew up knowing my older brother Adrian was the center of my parents' universe long before I understood what favoritism meant. He was born after years of failed attempts, fertility treatments, and whispered prayers. While I arrived 14 months later as an unexpected surprise nobody had prepared for, my baby photos were stored in a shoebox in the closet, while Adrian's filled 3 albums on the living room shelf. When I was 7, I found my birth certificate tucked inside a folder labeled Unplanned, written in my mother's neat handwriting. When I asked her what it meant, she laughed and told me it was just a joke, but something about the way my father avoided my eyes told me it wasn't. Adrian got new sneakers every school year while I wore his scuffed ones with the toes creased from how he dragged his feet. On my 9th birthday, I asked for a bicycle after watching kids in the neighborhood ride together every afternoon. That evening, Adrian wheeled a brand new mountain bike into the driveway, and I assumed it was mine, until my father handed me a secondhand pink bike with rust along the handlebars and said, "You don't need anything fancy, Olivia. Adrian's more active than you." When I cried, my mother told me I was being dramatic and reminded me that Adrian had always been sensitive, so I should be careful not to upset him. That became the rule in our house. Adrian's feelings mattered, and mine were inconvenient. In middle school, I won first place at the regional science fair, beating out students from 5 different schools, and I remember standing in the auditorium clutching my trophy while scanning the crowd for my parents, only to find 2 empty seats where they should have been. Later that night, they explained they'd stayed home because Adrian had a headache and didn't want to be left alone. My mother suggested next time I should tell them if the event was really important, so they could decide whether to attend. At 13, I started getting straight A's while Adrian struggled to pass his classes, but when report cards came home, his were taped proudly to the refrigerator with magnets shaped like stars, while mine were quietly placed in a drawer. My father once told me, "You don't need praise, Olivia. You're naturally good at school. Adrian works harder, so we celebrate his effort." Every milestone followed the same pattern. When I made varsity debate, Adrian had a bad day at practice, and dinner became about encouraging him. When I earned Student of the Month, Adrian forgot his homework, and my parents spent the evening helping him reorganize his backpack. Over time, I learned to shrink my victories, to speak softly about achievements, to smile politely when Adrian received congratulations for things I had done better. And by the time I reached high school, I understood that being invisible was easier than being overlooked. The pattern followed me into adulthood, reaching its breaking point the day I received my acceptance letter to Columbia with a full academic scholarship. I came home shaking with excitement, imagining the rare moment when my parents might celebrate me, only to find them gathered around Adrian, who had just been fired from his job at a car dealership for missing too many shifts. My mother was rubbing his shoulders, telling him he deserved better, while my father blamed his boss for not recognizing Adrian's potential. I stood in the doorway holding my envelope until my hands started to ache. Then I finally announced the news, expecting at least a smile. Instead, my mother sighed and said, "Olivia, can this wait? Your brother's going through something right now." My acceptance letter stayed unopened on the kitchen counter while they spent an hour reassuring Adrian about his future. Later that night, my grandmother pulled me aside and quietly revealed that my parents had tried for years to give Adrian a sibling because they didn't want him to be lonely. But when I excelled in school and surpassed him in ways they hadn't expected, they struggled with the comparison and began protecting him instead. Hearing that explanation didn't fix anything, but it made the years of imbalance make sense. College became my escape, and at Columbia, I met Chase, someone who listened when I spoke and celebrated my achievements without hesitation. He admired my ambition instead of feeling threatened by it, and for the first time, I experienced what it meant to be prioritized. When he proposed during our final semester, I cried not only because I loved him, but because someone had finally chosen me first. We spent a year planning our wedding, carefully selecting a date that worked for both families, sending invitations 8 months in advance, and confirming repeatedly that everyone could attend. 3 weeks before the ceremony, my mother called with an unusually casual tone. She explained that Adrian had just gotten engaged and decided to host an engagement celebration on the same day as my wedding, adding that they felt it was important to support him, because this was such a big step in his life. I reminded her that my wedding date had been set for months, but she responded that Adrian didn't want to postpone because his fiancé's parents were only available that weekend. When I asked if they were truly choosing his party over my wedding, my mother hesitated before saying they might try to attend part of the reception if timing allowed. After the call ended, I sat in silence, feeling a familiar ache settle in my chest. On the morning of my wedding, I stood in the bridal suite staring at my phone, still half hoping my parents would change their minds. That's when a quiet knock came at the door, and Chase's father, Robert, stepped inside. He hesitated before speaking, then told me he knew my parents weren't coming, and that if I needed someone to walk me down the aisle, he would be honored to stand in that place. He admitted he'd thought of me as family long before the wedding was planned. The offer hit me harder than I expected, because it wasn't obligation or pity, it was genuine pride. After a long moment, I nodded and thanked him, feeling a mixture of gratitude and heartbreak. When the ceremony began, Robert offered his arm and we stepped into the aisle together, the music swelling as guests turned to watch. Halfway down, I caught sight of movement in the front row where my mother suddenly appeared, slipping quietly into an empty seat near the aisle. She must have left Adrian's engagement party early after relatives started asking questions, because she looked rushed and unsettled, clutching her purse tightly while watching another man walk her daughter toward the altar. Robert squeezed my arm gently, and I focused forward, determined not to let the moment unravel. As we reached the front, he kissed my cheek and whispered that he was proud of me, words I had spent my entire childhood hoping to hear from my own parents. The ceremony continued beautifully, but during the reception, my mother approached me alone, her voice trembling as she admitted she hadn't realized how painful it would be to see someone else step into their place, explaining that my father had stayed at Adrian's party because he didn't think it would matter as much, and that they both regretted their decision. I listened quietly, then told her that Robert walked me down the aisle because he chose me without hesitation, something I had waited my entire life to experience. She started crying, apologizing repeatedly, but I told her gently that this wasn't about one wedding day. It was about years of being treated as second place. The following following morning, my phone filled with missed calls and messages from my parents apologizing repeatedly, but I felt an unfamiliar sense of peace and decided not to respond. Weeks later, a letter arrived from Adrian urging me to forgive them and reminding me that family should always come first. That's when I realized I had spent my entire life putting family first, while they placed me second. I folded the letter carefully before setting it aside without replying.